So recently I made a video about how Detective Pikachu's animation is better than the Lion King remakes. In this video I talked about the adaptations of the two films from the 2D franchises to 3D animation. Back in June, Nintendo had a summer sale on their eShop, and this included games like Hollow Knight, Cuphead, and Gris. And with it being announced that Cuphead is getting its own show on Netflix, I decided to take a look at the longevity of 2D animation in video games. Now, during the Nintendo Summer Sale, I purchased Hollow Knight and Cuphead, but not Gris. However, based on what I have seen and what others have said, I still felt I should include this game. I feel it's also worth noting that all three of these games are indie games, the development teams being Team Cherry for Hollow Knight, Studio MDHR for Cuphead, and Nomada Studio for Gris. Compare this to the multitude of large companies. While yes, these larger companies are able to put more games out, those games aren't always well received. And when working in a large game developer company, you are working for a company who at the end of the day only cares about money. That's not to say that the indie companies don't care about money, but their passion for what they want to create comes first. And while I am sure companies like EA and Ubisoft have plenty of talented and devoted people on their staff, many of them aren't in a position to create what they want to. It's definitely something I see as being more of a streamlined process with deadlines to make and approvals to get from superiors. Where in the indie studios, everyone must work, collaborate, and build off one another. It's definitely a more personal work environment. But outside of the general work environment and staffing, one of the biggest differences between indie developers and large developers is how they approach art direction. If you look at most AAA developer games, they aim for realism. And while yes, this is very impressive, I do have some issues with the never-ending goal to achieve near lifelike realism. Now this is dipping into something which is the uncanny valley. There are plenty of YouTube videos out there explaining the uncanny valley and even more specifically how it relates to video games, so I won't go into too much detail on the topic. Quote, "The uncanny valley is the hypothesized relationship between the degree of an object's resemblance to a human being and the emotional response to such an object. The concept of the uncanny valley suggests humanoid objects which appear almost, but not exactly, like real human beings elicit uncanny or strangely familiar feelings of eeriness and revulsion in observers. The valley denotes a dip in the observer's affinity for the replica, a relation that otherwise increases with the replica's human likeness." An example of this outside of video games are androids. In recent years, developing technology where an android can pass off as a human has become a common pursuit in the field of robotics. And while incredibly impressive, there is something that is off about a lot of these androids. While we can look at them and identify that it has the appearance of a human, the movements and mannerisms are what makes the android look far from human and elicit that negative response. In an attempt to make something more human, it ironically does the opposite, that something is so similar, so familiar that we are able to quickly pick up on what makes something non-human. And we can also see this in video games. When the hyper-realistic approach to video games was being pursued, we got some interesting results like Heavy Rain, where facial expressions and movements were odd. It may not necessarily elicit a negative response or unease to seeing an android, but viewers and players are quickly able to distinguish that while the characters look human, their actions, mannerisms, and facial expressions are not. I think of Heavy Rain and LA Noire, and even more recently Mass Effect Andromeda as good examples of this. Although Heavy Rain and LA Noire have a bit more leeway on this since these games came out in 2010 and 2011. Andromeda, which came out in 2017, doesn't really have an excuse for this. But games today have been pretty good about capturing realism without making the characters too uncanny. Detroit Become Human, which is by the same company that did Heavy Rain, did a fantastic job of this. However, you can still see some stiffness in the mouth and lips. And I also feel that eyes have always been a difficult area of the face to nail down. After all, people generally look at others' eyes first. So when there's a slightly dead or glazed over look to the eye, it's already incredibly easy to point out something as non-human. I'm sure that within the next few years, technology will only improve and this will look outdated. Which is another thing to consider when looking at realism in video games. Eventually, realistic graphics will look outdated. I'm sure whenever the next Quantum Dream game comes out, people will be saying that Detroit Become Human's graphics look outdated. And here we have the endless cycle of capturing lifelike realism in video games. Which brings me to the point of 2D animation in video games and how opting for stylized or 2D animation in-game increases the longevity of a video game. So why would a developer choose 2D? For starters, it's a lot cheaper. Hollow Knight, Cuphead, and Gris are all indie games, meaning that they don't have a large budget to spend on creating realistic graphics. That's not to say that 2D animation is inferior to realistic graphics, just that it's more economical for smaller companies. But by utilizing 2D animation, these games automatically stand out. All three games have distinct styles from one another, which makes the games more marketable and offers better opportunities for merchandise. I mean, you got Hollow Knight and Cuphead plushies, so clearly the art direction is working. But even more than being the economical choice, more marketable, and more profitable from merch, the 2D animation just looks damn good. The fact that every movement you see on screen is drawn by hand is incredible, yet each game has such a unique look and feel to their animation. Hollow Knight has simple yet interesting character design showcasing an interpretation on Bug Civilization Underground. The style has a dark and dreary, almost gothic feel to it at times. Compare this to Cuphead, which draws heavy inspiration from 1930s Disney animation. There have been a couple animation tests posted online during the production of this game, and it's almost mind-blowing how smooth and clean these animations are. The game overall has a very upbeat and fun vibe to it. The boss fights all have fun and unique twists in their designs, and there are even nice little touches like the fuzzy grain filter to make it look like you're playing this game on a theater screen from the 1930s. And then looking at Gris, you have these bright, vibrant colors, use of geometric shapes in the platforming and environment, and gorgeous watercolor. When Gris is jumping around, you can see the smooth animation as she twirls and how seamlessly her cape moves with her body. When I look at clips like these, I just find it far more interesting and captivating than any game that aims to be as realistic as possible. But this all leads to the point of longevity. When I show a clip of Heavy Rain compared to Detroit Become Human, it's pretty obvious Detroit is an improvement. 8 years makes a pretty big difference. But if I were to look back on Hollow Knight, Cuphead, or Gris in 8 years, I probably wouldn't see that big of a difference or feel that the game looks outdated. And this is because of the style and art direction that the developers chose. No matter what, these games will outlast many of its competitors from larger companies when it comes to the longevity of a game. Think about games like Limbo and Braid. People today still talk about how great these games are and how much they love the art style for each. Hell, even a 3D game like Journey is still talked about today because of its distinct style and art direction. Whenever I hear people talk about these indie games, 99.9% of the time it's praise. Yet when I think about the Elder Scrolls or Grand Theft Auto series, which have great games, their graphics outdate them, and this makes it harder to go back once the newest installments come out. And I remember playing Oblivion for the first time on my cousin's Xbox 360 and thinking about how great the graphics looked. I was only like 10, guys, so I really didn't know any better. But now, not so much, and when I was younger, I probably fell into that mindset that if graphics were more realistic, then that meant they were better. I remember not initially playing Wind Waker because it looked cartoony, but Twilight Princess looked more realistic. I ended up playing Wind Waker and years later regretted not playing it sooner. It really wasn't until I was in Blockbuster and my mom had gotten a membership where I could rent a game a week. Having run out of my top choices, I picked up a game I had never heard of before. That game was Okami. And Okami was what completely changed my perception on how graphics affect video games. It was something I had never seen before, traditional Japanese artwork brought to life in 3D. And initially, this game was going to be more realistic. There is even a test trailer showing this. Could you imagine Okami looking like this instead of the gorgeousness that is this? And although this video has mainly focused on 2D animation, despite being 3D, Okami still exemplifies why good art direction trumps realism. Okami was first released on the PS2 in 2006, and since then the game has been ported over to the Wii, the PS3, PC, PS4, Xbox One, and the Nintendo Switch. The only thing that has changed is that they've bumped up the resolution just to make the graphics look even better and more colorful. And if you think about this concept outside of video games, you can also see this with Disney. I'm sure many of you have rewatched some of your favorite Disney movies like The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, Hercules, Mulan, and so on. When they release these films on digital and Blu-ray, they don't change the drawings or animation at all, they just adjust it to the proper resolution of today's technology. But when I watch a Disney film from my childhood, I'm not thinking, wow, this film looks old and outdated. I still enjoy it because the animation itself is timeless and will likely still be watched and enjoyed by people for generations to come. And like Disney and Okami, this can happen with Hollow Knight, Cuphead, and Gris, all because of their art direction. Even though Okami is 13 years old, people still play it today, and perhaps down the road we'll be getting ported versions of Hollow Knight, Cuphead, and Gris in 13 years on whatever the next generation of consoles are. Ultimately, when it comes to the gaming industry, I hope we continue to get more indie developers that blow the competition out of the water. I want to see what these developers have in store for us because the amount of time, work, and effort they put in is absolutely staggering. And when you see end results like this, it's kind of hard not to want these games to live on for years to come.